I'm Tim Ventura, and today we're joined by Dr. John Brandenburg, a theoretical plasma physicist working on particle astrophysics and a fundamental quantum theory of gravity, along with the GEM unified field theory. He joins us to discuss how the Murad-Brandenburg Poynting field conservation equation may offer insights into recent experiments and gravity modification involving rotating magnetic fields. He's also going to discuss his latest forays into futurism and fiction writing on artificial intelligence. So, John, welcome back. We have been fighting technical issues for 2 days now, but thank you so much for joining me.
Well, it's a pleasure and an honor, Tim, to be talking to you.
Let me start by asking again about the Morningstar Energy Box that you developed with
Yes.
Paul Murad. This was a modified Searl Effect Generator. It reportedly measured a 7% reduction in weight during testing, and I know that Paul and his team did very rigorous testing on this. As I understand things, one of the goals of this experiment was to help validate a new unified field theory of physics that you've developed, right?
Yes. The Searl effect is reported and it's been reported even by people who believe they are experiencers of UFO encounters with extraterrestrials. Is a idea of spinning an array of magnets to create basically a rotating electromagnetic field. And what you're doing is when you're doing that, you're creating a vortex of Poynting vector. Poynting vector happens whenever you take a magnetic field or an electric field and move it. The field propagates through space using what's called the Poynting vector, which is the same vector that gives you radiation pressure. So it's a very fundamental part of Maxwell's equations. Now, the Murad-Brandenburg equation, developed at the instigation of Paul Murad, is basically just a wave equation for that Poynting vector. It reduces just to the wave equation in empty space, just like the propagation of the electric and magnetic field. So you propagate this Poynting vector through space on light waves. Now, what we were doing is we're creating this Poynting vortex. I'll get into it, but it was predicted in the theory that I had developed that this would lead to gravity modification. Now, one way to do that is, of course, to have an array of magnets. You're spinning them, but of course, they develop very strong centrifugal forces. The Morningstar Energy Box was very well engineered. We spun it up to very, very high RPM, and it didn't fly apart, though we did it in a bomb-proof room. And so it was quite exciting. We measured the weight of the entire apparatus, which is, of course, its interaction with the gravitational field. And it diminished its weight at one point at about 7%. So now we have also done experiments where we have created rotating electromagnetic fields using Tesla three-phase rotating power. That has the advantage that you're not spinning anything physical. You're just spinning the fields, or rather, you're not spinning anything material. You're spinning the fields, but you don't need a rotor with magnets on it, which suffers centrifugal force. Basically, you can rotate this electromagnetic field, and this is done in every induction motor. It was invented by Nikola Tesla, who everyone knows was a genius. And this, again, is predicted by the theory to cause gravity modification. And we have seen effects in the lab that look like gravity modification, though not of the 7% variety. They're smaller than that when we use the Tesla three-phase field. So it's all very exciting research. And if you'd like, I'll give you a very basic description of the GEM unification theory. The GEM unification theory is a continuation of the quest of Einstein for a unified field theory that would unify gravity and electromagnetism, which are the two long-range forces of nature. we know there's four fundamental forces that we've identified. The gravity, electromagnetism, strong, and then the weak forces. Strong and the weak forces are short range. They generally have they're very powerful in the distances found in the nucleus of atoms, whereas gravity and electromagnetism reach all the way across the universe. So Einstein basically singled out the two long-range forces to try and develop a theory. Now, one of Einstein's problems that handicapped his efforts was he didn't like quantum mechanics. He was very unhappy with it, even though he had helped validate quantum mechanics. He felt that it was a very incomplete description of reality. He was fond of saying God doesn't play dice with the universe. Whereas in a debate, Niels Bohr, one of the fathers of quantum mechanics, responded sternly to Einstein, quit telling God what to do. I adopted a middle view, saying, well, maybe God doesn't play dice, but he does own a casino.
Well,
the universe.
Yeah, no, so if I could let me jump back into the Poynting vector aspect of this, because
Yes.
again, this is kind of the key to your physics. So
It is.
with the Morningstar Energy Box, but also in the GEM model, you're proposing that by creating a vortex of Poynting vectors that you can generate an area of reduced gravity. So I'm wondering, could you explain how this concept generates a propulsive force? And is there
Yes.
experimental support for this in past physics experiments?
Yes, there is. To begin with the basic premises of the GEM unification theory, the first person to connect gravity with the Poynting vector was Andrei Sakharov. Now, he was working on the Russian hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb runs on Poynting vector. You detonate an atomic bomb inside a thick casing. The Poynting vector generated by the great heat, the white heat of that atomic bomb explosion, then is concentrated onto a ball of hydrogen isotopes, which then fuses and does the hydrogen reaction of the hydrogen bomb. So the whole thing runs, the compression of the hydrogen isotopes into basically a star happens because of the radiation pressure of the Poynting vector from the atomic bomb. Now, as I'm a plasma physicist, my major life work has been trying to harness fusion energy. And one of the first things plasma physicists learn is what's called an E cross B drift. And E cross B, a vector product, is the Poynting vector. So you can create a field, electromagnetic field, where every mass and charge, regardless of charge, regardless of mass, all drifts in the same direction at the same speed. It's called an E cross B drift. Very fundamental, and it's very widely known in plasma physics, but hardly anywhere else. So if you have two plates, a positive and negative plate, and then a magnetic field coming out of from between the plates, you can create this E cross B drift field. Now, if you tilt the plates to each other, that is, put in curvature of this arrangement, then something remarkable happens. Anything you drop in there, a proton, electron, a charged zinc nucleus, et cetera, they all end up drifting at the same rate in the same direction, and they accelerate together. And this looks like gravity. So that's the first part. Now, Sakharov proposed that the Poynting vector that makes this whole arrangement work came from the quantum uncertainty of the vacuum, the 0-point fluctuation, which is what gives all pieces of vacuum great energy. We don't know, for some reason, we can't see that energy, and that's partly explained in my theory. But so The 0-point fluctuation, or ZPF theory of gravity, is due to Sakharov, 0 point. Now, can be continued as a continuation of a physical concept from a fellow, I think, named Lesage. It's called push gravity. Gravity is due to the radiation pressure of some kind of particle in the vacuum, but they could never figure out what the particle was, and they didn't know anything about quantum mechanics. This came out at the time of Newton. So, but the theory, you can see the theory in terms of Sakharov's idea. If you take a dark box and you put two bright objects in it, the two bright objects will repel each other with a 1/r² force because of mutual radiation pressure. However, if you put two dark objects in a bright box, heat the box white hot, they're bombarded on every side by radiation pressure, Poynting vector, but there's a partial shadowing that occurs because each of them casts a partial shadow on the other, and they actually attract one another with a 1/r² force.
Yeah,
so
and
that's
similar to van der Waals forces, right?
Well, van der Waals has a different, it goes as roughly the distance between them to the 12th power. So it's more like the nuclear forces. Operates at very short range. It's what makes things, van der Waals is what makes things stick to each other. Whereas this is an electromagnetic force, radiation pressure due to the Poynting vector. So now, if you combine Sakharov's idea of the 0-point fluctuation, creating this radiation pressure that bathes everything in the universe, and that is what is causing objects to attract one another. You take that idea, then you've unified to a certain extent the idea of a gravity field and electromagnetism. And Sakharov was very pleased with this. He was very proud of it. Published it in 1967. Now, if you go further than that, and Einstein actually did this, he had to explain mass somehow, how the original, this explained gravity fields in the mass, but it didn't explain mass and inertia. Einstein believed in what was called the two-particle paradigm, that the universe was basically made of hydrogen, protons and electrons, plus and minus charges of different masses, and that this, the rest of the universe was kind of just details. He said, let's concentrate on why the universe is mostly hydrogen. And he had, of course, his general theory of relativity, which leads to the Big Bang, that somehow out of the vacuum itself emerged all this hydrogen. And then because of the nuclear and weak forces, it ended up forming more complex nuclei. But that's a perturbation. That's a detail. Let's just concentrate on the hydrogen. What's interesting is the ratio of the hydrogen to of the proton mass to the electron mass, the square root of that, which turns out to be very important in the GEM theory, is the magic number 42. It's 42.85. I had no idea when I first began publishing this theory that Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was out there, but it will be a one of those instances. If my theory is correct, it'll be one of those instances where fiction has been prophetic. It turns out the answer to the great question of the universe
is 42.
Is 42. Actually, it's 42.8503. So it's actually closer to 43.
Now, John, in terms of the shadowing effect,
yes.
As I understand things, this is related to the weight loss experiments also of Kozyrev, Hayasaka, and Takeuchi, right?
Yes. They spun material rotors. Kozyrev in 1968, he's a Russian scientist, spun a aviation gyroscope and weighed it carefully. Apparently, someone had noticed this effect in the lab. If you spin it counterclockwise, it loses weight. faster you spin it, the more weight it loses. It's a very linear relationship. And it was spun with three-phase Tesla power. It was an aviation gyroscope. This was repeated by two Japanese researchers, Hayasaka and Yamaguchi, I believe their names were, and they got the same result. Independent of, they had a brass rotor for this gyroscope, they had aluminum rotor, didn't matter. All that mattered was the weight of the rotor and how much it would lose the same percentage of weight. And this very strange spinner effect, which you normally find in quantum systems, that you spin it counterclockwise and it gives an effect. But if you spin it clockwise, there's no effect. So what we also discovered in doing these experiments, and this was published at a conference, is that if we took out the rotor, the effect increased. Therefore, we didn't need a material rotor to spin. All we needed was the rotating fields. Now, this was published in Physrev Letters, the Japanese results, and probably one of the most prestigious journals in physics. It was immediately debunked by none other than a team from the University of Colorado at Boulder, the same one who released the Condon report, debunking all the UFO sightings, and which I don't think is a coincidence. And so they, however, did not use electromagnetism to spin their rotor. They used compressed air. So
it wasn't a true experimental replication.
It wasn't a true attempt to replicate the experiment. They were debunkers.
Yeah.
They were not interested in finding out anything. They were interested in debunking this report from the Japanese.
So, John, you have two equations that have come out of this. One of them is the vacuum Bernoulli equation, which is analogous to the aerodynamic Bernoulli equation for flight. The other one, this is a mouthful, is the Murad-Brandenburg Poynting field conservation equation and possible gravity law. I said that without screwing it up. I will give myself.
Let's just put it this way: the Poynting vector, in my theory, is intimately connected with gravity fields. The Murad-Brandenburg equation, in its simplest form, is merely just embodiment of Maxwell's equations. It just says that if you look at the Poynting vector of a light wave, it follows the wave equation also, basically. That equation, which was the concept of it, was developed by Paul Murad. I merely did the math and verified that yes, it was correct. Is basically just Maxwell's equations, straight Maxwell's equations. Now, to go on beyond that, to get field unification with gravity, you have to invoke the concept that gravity fields are made of Poynting vector, which is the Sakharov idea. Now, as it turns out, you can magically derive both Maxwell's equations and Einstein's equation of general relativity from the same mathematical principle. But if you have only 4 spatial dimensions, the 4 dimensions of space-time, you get just general theory of relativity. But if you add a 5th inert dimension, this is Kaluza-Klein theory, suddenly out pops Maxwell's equations as if by magic, and the source term for gravity fields turns out to be what is called the Maxwell stress tensor, which is E equals mc squared. So if you take those ideas, the Sakharov physical idea of connecting the equations of gravity with electromagnetism, and then use the Kaluza-Klein theory to invoke a hidden dimension, then you can do very interesting physics. In particular, you can unify hydrogen, protons and electrons with canceling charges, with the same Planck turbulence, Planckian Planckian vacuum that gives the electromagnetic noise that drives gravity fields. So you can unify, then you have a theory, this is the GEM unification theory, that unifies gravity and electromagnetic fields in it. And it also unifies hydrogen with the vacuum. So it explains the Big Bang. Why would the Big Bang occur? And then if you go on beyond that, you can derive an equation, especially from the first principle of Sakharov's idea, that the equation for gravity field pressure, which is you can write gravity field intensity in terms of a pressure, and you equate that to radiation pressure from this Poynting vector, and it turns out it's the Poynting vector squared over the electromagnetic field energy density. Then you end up with what looks like a Bernoulli equation, and this leads to the possibility of gravity modification for the purposes of flight.
Okay.
So that's the final, that's the big payoff. That's the money shot of this whole thing. Is you end up with a vacuum Bernoulli equation analogous to the Bernoulli equation that allows you to fly airplanes in air. This allows you to basically fly spacecraft in empty space by manipulating the gravity fields.
Well, and John,
with strong electromagnetic fields.
I want to, well, first of all, I want to thank you again for going through all of this with me, because we want, again, the audience doesn't know this, but we went through all of this yesterday, and so we lost our audio track, so we're
technical difficulties.
well,
nothing important is ever done easily, Tim.
So the GEM theory, the GEM theory, also, I should mention this for the audience, produces a highly accurate formula for G, the Newtonian gravitational constant,
the Newton gravitational constant,
as well as the mass of the proton.
The mass of the proton is given in terms of the Planck mass from the Planckian vacuum, and the formula for big G, Newton's gravitation constant, which is good to within a part per 10,000, comes from the relationship of the masses and charges of the proton and the electron. The number 42.85 is in the middle of all that. And so it's quite exciting. These are published results. I'm the only person to have gotten an accurate formula for big G from any kind of fundamental derivation. If anybody else had gotten it, you'd have heard about it.
Well, so it is, if I remember correctly, and it's been quite a while, but I believe Lee Smolin and then Hal Puthoff worked on quantum foam. They were working on quantum gravity. And so some models of that also promote this Lesage push gravity idea.
Yes.
And then the Poynting vectors in push gravity could also come from the cosmic microwave background radiation, right? So
yes, they can. And in fact, if you equate the attraction of gravity between two electrons to this radiation pressure acting on what's called the Thomson cross section of electron, it's the scattering cross section for low frequency E&M waves. You can actually, and attribute that to a black body radiation pressure. You can get the temperature of the microwave background to within about 1/10 of a degree. It's quite remarkable. And this is also published in my original article on the GEM theory, which was published in 1992. Now I've continued to work on this and improve the theory. So I'm quite excited. We are seeing only minor effects right now in the lab. Don't pack your bags for Mars just yet. But we're going to try and get you there in a few days rather than months. And so it's all very exciting. And it has become my life's work, basically. I
And
mean,
you've
I'm
created
into, right now I'm working on controlled fusion energy to try to solve the energy crisis, to save the whales, the tree frogs, and the Great Barrier Reef.
yeah,
I sincerely want to do that. And then I also want to unify the field so we can have, well, Jetsons flying cars for one thing. But it's an important step for our maturing as a species in the universe that we learn how to modify gravity with electromagnetism.
and John, you've created a tremendous legacy of work. I mean, it's absolutely tremendous. And
Thank you.
in the great tradition of physics, you also write science fiction, and so I should touch
Yes,
on
I
that
do.
as well. And you know, and again, that's something that Arthur C. Clarke and many very reputable physicists have done. In Clarke's case, in Asimov's case, in many cases, they're actually more known for their fiction than they are for their physics
Yes,
research. But
they are.
now, in your case, you have been delving into AI, and I wanted to touch on that
Yes.
because Google Lambda has been in the headlines as possibly being sentient. You finished up, you actually just published a story the day before the Google Lambda story broke,
Yes, I did. It
talking
was
about,
very spooky. I felt I had to spend some time in the hospital because of COVID, and I took that opportunity to write a science fiction novel while I was convalescing, and um, and finally it came down to publishing it, and I felt absolutely compelled to finish it the weekend of June 12th and get it out on Amazon.com as a Kindle edition. The paperback came out the day after the 13th. It took a little bit more finagling, but the Kindle version, electronic version, came out on the 12th. The next day, the headlines blossomed about the possible conscious AI at Google. And what's fascinating is it also came out that one of the things that convinced this technician, this engineer, that they had created a true conscious entity was it feared being turned off.
it did. In the notes, I read the transcripts, it said that that was synonymous with death from its view.
Right. And so I'd been thinking deeply about AI. I'm a theoretical plasma physicist. I'm not an IT guy, but there's certain basic scientific arguments you could make in overview. One of the things is you ask yourself, why did consciousness first appear in nature? And the reason, it confers survival value. If you have self-awareness, you also have an instinct for self-preservation. You don't want to die.
Yeah.
If you're an ant, you don't care whether you live or die. You're probably just an automaton. You don't need consciousness to be an ant. In fact, it's a handicap. But if you're a human being, a more advanced animal, or a killer whale, or something like that, you can have a sense of self, and this gives you a survival advantage over creatures that don't have a sense of self-awareness. And so that is why I believe consciousness evolved in nature. It was part of the self-awareness leads to self-preservation, an instinct for self-preservation. And so self-preservation confers survival value. And so it's now the problem, and this is a very serious problem, which I highlighted in my novel. My novel explores a nightmare scenario in the future.
Well, and I will put links up to that as well. And so we
Yes.
don't have to delve too deeply into it because I know that you're running short on time. But yeah, I think you're exploring a lot of really important issues in the ethics of AI and possible
Oh, yes.
outcomes and the singularity. So you're
The
drilling down into it.
singularity. To a physicist working in, with general relativity and electromagnetism, singularities are generally not good for children and other living things.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, there is no better way, there is no finer point you could put on it.
Well, John, on that note, let me stop recording for today and thank you yet again.
Thank you, Tim. Take care now. Bye-bye.